Not only can we look at the global indices, but we can look at the indices for each of the 6 ivory classes separately. Notice that the y-axis in each of these cases is different, and this is because for each of the ivory classes we've standardised the index so that the 1998 value is set to 100, and we can see the relative number of transactions through time. A couple of points to notice are that we can see we have in 4 of the ivory classes we have quite a rapid increase in the last few years in the number of transactions. Particularly, we can see the largest ones are in the small worked ivory class, and we can also see quite an increase in the other 3 categories as well. For the small raw ivory class, we sort of see an increase up to 2010 and then a decline in the last year. And this may be, one explanation may be because consignments are getting larger, and in particular we can see that in the medium raw ivory class we can see that between 2010 and 2011 there's been quite a rapid increase, which almost mirrors the decrease in the small raw ivory class. For the large worked ivory class we can see a much more variable pattern, a lot more uncertainty, and this is probably because we have very few seizures in this ivory class at all, making it difficult to estimate what is going on. If we want to look at all of the ivory classes together and see their relative contributions to both the transactions index and the weight index, we can see we get quite interesting and different stories. In figure A, we look at the transactions index, and you can see that the biggest category in each year is the small worked ivory class. So suggesting that, particularly in the last few years, that about 70% of illegal ivory transactions in 2011 were small worked ivory seizures. However, if we look at the bottom graph and we look at the total weight, what proportion came from each ivory class, we can see that the dominating category is the large raw ivory class. So we can see that although there are very few seizures in that category, few shipments in that category, in figure A the dark green is not very large, we can see that although there might not be many transactions, they actually contribute a large amount to the weight. And then we can see that sort of medium raw and large worked ivory classes also contribute quite a lot to that. So quite different pictures. And we can also look to see how in each of the 6 ivory classes the relative contribution of each of 10 different subregions. There's a lot of detail in the paper about these different categories, but here you can see that in the raw ivory classes they tend to be dominated by what's happening in Africa. In the small worked ivory class, which remember is the one with the most transactions, we can see quite a consistent amount coming from Europe and North America over time, and in the last few years a rapid increase in China. And we can see that also to some extent with the medium worked ivory class. We can see for the large both raw and worked categories there is a lot of ivory coming, a lot of transactions activity in Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia as well. Countries, we can see that in fact China is the country that dominates over the whole of the analysis, but a whole set of other countries are also important. For example, Thailand is another major player, as are Vietnam, Philippines and Taiwan. We think these last 3 countries are likely to be acting as transit points for onward trade to China and Thailand. In Africa, we can see a number of countries in Central Africa and also in East Africa are major kind of sources of illegal ivory activity, and these are partly places where there is a lot of ivory and also where they are acting as exit points for the ivory. So overall, we've seen that there's an alarming increase in the ivory trade, particularly in the last few years. We've seen that simple data summaries can be misleading, and in fact we've had to correct for variable seizure and reporting rates between countries and over time. The actual analysis is quite complex, but despite that we've been able to derive quite simple indicators, our transactions index and our weight index, to describe what's happening. It's important to remember these are only relative estimates of the trade because we don't know the actual seizure and reporting rates. We just have got a way of measuring how they differ between countries and over time. The analysis presented here is really a prerequisite for understanding or carrying out an analysis of the drivers of the trade. To do that, we would need to consider all the different causal mechanisms which influence the trade as one complete picture so that we can understand how different potential drivers interact. And finally, we would hope there might be some scope for applying this methodology to records of seizures of other illicit goods such as drugs as well. Obviously, the results are important in what we're presenting here, but we would also like to emphasise the development of the methodology for accounting for the biases in the data. The work for this project, this paper, was funded by a Darwin Initiative. It was Project 17020, and it was called Enhancing the Elephant Trade Information System to Guide CITES Policy. This project was led by me when I was working at the University of Reading with Bob Byrne, and was in collaboration with Tom Milliken of Traffic International and its Traffic, who manage ETIS. And we wouldn't be able to do any of the work presented here without Louisa Sangalakula, the ETIS administrator, the CITES Secretariat and the CITES parties, and all the law enforcement agencies who've collected data over the years.